Daniel had always believed he was ready for anything in life, until the day his world felt like it was about to crumble. He and Sarah had been married for a few years, and everything seemed to be falling into place. They had their own little home in the suburbs, their jobs were steady, and they were planning their future together. They talked about having children, imagining what their family might look like. But when Sarah found out she was pregnant with quadruplets, everything changed. At first, it was exciting. Daniel couldn't believe it. 4 babies at once. It seemed like a miracle, but soon, that excitement turned into worry. There were so many things to consider. How could they afford this? Would they be able to handle the responsibility? Daniel, who had always been someone who liked to control his life, started to feel overwhelmed by the uncertainty of what was to come. As the months passed, Sarah's belly grew, and so did Daniel's anxiety. He had always been a responsible man, but the thought of raising 4 babies at once was too much for him. He began to pull away from Sarah, becoming more distant. His mind was racing with questions he didn't have answers to. How could he possibly be the father these children needed? Could he even handle the challenges of having so many children? One evening, just a few weeks before the babies were due, Daniel sat in their small living room, his hands folded tightly in his lap. Sarah sat across from him, rubbing her swollen belly, her eyes filled with love and anticipation. But all Daniel could feel was fear. He had never been one to talk about his feelings, but that night, he knew he had to say something. "I'm not ready for this," he blurted out, his voice shaking slightly. "I don't think I can do this, Sarah." Sarah looked at him in shock. "What do you mean? We'll do this together. We've always talked about having a family, and now it's happening." But Daniel couldn't shake the feeling that everything was spiraling out of his control. The more Sarah tried to reassure him, the more he pulled away. In his mind, the pressure of it all was unbearable. The responsibilities, the challenges, the sacrifices, it all felt too much for him. The fear of not being able to live up to the expectations, to be the man Sarah and their children needed, grew stronger with each passing day. Finally, one night, after a long argument where they both said things they didn't mean, Daniel made the decision that would change everything. He couldn't bear the thought of being a father. He couldn't handle the idea of 4 babies depending on him. So, in a moment of panic, he packed his bags and left. He didn't even say goodbye. He just left. Sarah woke up the next morning to find her home empty. Daniel was gone, and there was no note, no explanation. Just an empty room, a suitcase left behind, and the sound of her heart breaking. She had no idea why he had left, and in that moment, she realized she was going to face the hardest challenge of her life alone. Daniel didn't look back as he drove away. The road ahead seemed easier, he thought. But deep inside, a small voice kept whispering that he had just made the biggest mistake of his life. The first few weeks after Daniel left were the hardest for Sarah. She had no warning, no explanation, just an empty house and the overwhelming responsibility of raising 4 children on her own. She lay awake at night, staring at the ceiling, feeling the weight of the world on her shoulders. She couldn't understand why Daniel had left, why he had abandoned her at the most difficult time of her life. But as much as the pain hurt, there was no time to dwell on it. She was carrying quadruplets, and they needed her. When the babies were born, it was nothing short of a miracle. 4 tiny faces, each one different but perfect in their own way. The doctors and nurses were amazed at how well they were doing, but Sarah couldn't help feeling alone. She had no partner to help her through the sleepless nights, the endless feedings, the doctor's appointments, and all the other things that came with raising babies. It was all on her. There were days when the exhaustion felt unbearable. She would wake up in the morning, barely having slept, only to find that the babies needed her attention again. Her body ached from the lack of rest, and her heart ached from the emotional toll of being left behind. But no matter how tired she was, no matter how much she wanted to cry or give up, she couldn't. The babies needed her, and she would do whatever it took to take care of them. Sarah learned to manage everything by herself. She became an expert at multitasking, feeding one baby while holding another, changing diapers with one hand, and soothing the others with her feet. Her days were filled with endless work, but as each day passed, she grew stronger. The love she felt for her children pushed her forward, and little by little, she found her rhythm. But it wasn't easy. There were times when she felt like she was drowning. The bills piled up, and there were moments when she wasn't sure how she would make ends meet. She had to cut back on everything. No more eating out, no more new clothes, no more little luxuries. It was all about survival now. She couldn't help but wonder what could have been if Daniel had stayed. Would they have raised these children together? Would they have made it work? But those thoughts were fleeting. She had no time to dwell on them. She had to focus on what was in front of her, the babies who depended on her, who needed her love and care. Sarah didn't have many friends or family nearby, and the people who had once surrounded her were now distant. She tried to reach out to them, but they didn't understand. They couldn't understand what it was like to be a single mother, to face the challenges Sarah faced every day. She learned quickly that she had to be strong for herself, for her children. There was no one else to lean on. But despite all the hardships, there were moments of pure joy. The babies, as they grew, started to smile, laugh, and develop their own little personalities. Sarah felt a deep pride in watching them grow and learn. They were her everything. Her heart swelled with love every time she looked at them. They were worth every sacrifice, every tear. And though the road ahead was uncertain, Sarah knew one thing for sure: she would never give up. She had 4 reasons to keep going, 4 little lives that depended on her. No matter how hard it got, she would always keep fighting for them. After leaving Sarah, Daniel tried to move on with his life. At first, he told himself it was the right decision. He had been overwhelmed by the thought of becoming a father, and he convinced himself that stepping away from his responsibilities was the only way to regain control. But as time went on, Daniel realized how much emptier his life felt without Sarah and the children. He moved to a new city, hoping that a fresh start would help him forget everything he had left behind. He found a new job in a small office, one that didn't require much of his time or energy. The work was simple, but it allowed him to keep his mind off the life he had walked away from. He surrounded himself with new people, people who didn't know about his past, and for a while, that seemed to ease the guilt that lingered in his mind. In the evenings, Daniel went out to bars, met new people, and tried to have fun. He dated a few women, but nothing ever felt right. He couldn't shake the feeling that something was missing. He had thought that moving on would make him happy, but it didn't. His relationships were shallow, and he found himself thinking about Sarah and the children more often than he wanted to admit. There were times when he would walk past a family in the park or see a father with his kids, and it would hit him hard. The emptiness he felt was overwhelming. He would see a child laughing and playing, and it would remind him of the laughter he had missed out on. He remembered how happy he had been when Sarah told him they were going to have a family, and how quickly that joy had turned into fear. He had convinced himself that leaving was the only way to deal with it, but now, years later, he wasn't so sure. Daniel never reached out to Sarah. He told himself it was for the best. She deserved someone who could handle the pressure of parenthood, someone who could be there for her and the children in the way that he couldn't. But deep down, he knew he hadn't just abandoned them. He had abandoned himself. He had walked away from the chance to be a father, from the chance to be a family. The guilt ate at him, but he kept it buried, convinced that there was no way to fix what he had done. One evening, Daniel sat alone in his apartment, sipping on a drink as he flipped through the channels on TV. He came across a show about families, about parents raising their children together, and suddenly, his thoughts turned to Sarah and the Quadruplets. What had become of them? How were they doing? Did they miss him? Did they even know who he was? The thought of his children hit him like a wave. He hadn't seen them since they were babies, and he couldn't imagine what they looked like now. They would be so much older, probably completely different. He wondered if they had ever thought about him, or if they had grown up without ever knowing that their father had once been a part of their lives. The guilt weighed on him heavily as he stared out the window into the night. He had built a life for himself, but it didn't feel like a full life. There was a piece of him that he had left behind, and no matter how hard he tried to move forward, that piece kept pulling him back. He didn't know what the future held, but one thing was certain. He couldn't keep running from his past forever. The question was, could he ever find a way to make things right? Years passed, and life moved on. Daniel continued with his new life, though there was always a sense of emptiness that lingered. He tried to bury the past, focusing on work and the few relationships he had, but his thoughts would often drift back to Sarah and their children. He had convinced himself that it was better this way, that he wasn't ready to be a father. But deep down, he knew he had made a mistake. One day, while Daniel was back in his hometown for a work-related event, fate decided to intervene. It had been years since he had seen Sarah, and the thought of meeting her again was something he had never dared to entertain. But as he walked through the local coffee shop, something made him pause. He froze for a moment when he saw her. Sarah was sitting at a small table, sipping her coffee and reading a book. She looked exactly the same, yet different, stronger, more confident. Her hair had grown longer, and there were lines on her face that spoke of the years of hardship and strength she had endured. But there was still a kindness in her eyes, the same eyes that he had once loved so deeply. For a few moments, Daniel stood frozen in place, unsure of what to do. He hadn't planned this. He hadn't prepared himself for this kind of encounter. But before he could turn away, Sarah looked up from her book and saw him. Her expression was a mix of surprise and uncertainty. She didn't say anything at first, as if waiting for him to speak. "Sarah," Daniel said quietly, his voice filled with emotion. It's been a long time." She set the book down and stared at him for a moment, her face unreadable. Then, without a word, she stood up and walked over to him. There was no hug, no warm greeting, just a quiet acknowledgement of the years that had passed between them. "I never expected to see you again," she said softly, her voice steady, but with a hint of pain that Daniel could hear. "What are you doing here?" "I'm just passing through," he replied, his hands shoved into his pockets. He couldn't think of anything else to say. The awkwardness of the situation hung between them, thick and heavy. Sarah didn't speak for a moment, as if she was processing everything. Then she glanced down at the floor, her arms crossed over her chest. "I thought you had moved on," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "That you didn't care." Daniel's heart sank. He had always told himself that leaving was the best choice, but hearing her say those words brought back the guilt he had carried all these years. He had never imagined how much pain he had caused her. I'm sorry, Sarah," Daniel said, his voice cracking with emotion. "I made a terrible mistake. I was scared, and I ran away. But I never stopped thinking about you and the kids." Her eyes softened, but she didn't say anything right away. She looked at him for a long moment, as if weighing his words. Finally, she sighed and shook her head. "It doesn't matter now," she said quietly. "You made your choice, Daniel, and I've had to live with the consequences of that choice. We both have." Daniel wanted to apologize again, but the words seemed stuck in his throat. What could he possibly say to make things right? He had left her when she needed him the most, and there was no way to undo that. After a few more moments of silence, Sarah spoke again. "I'm glad you're okay," she said, her voice softer now. "But I think it's time we move on. I have my life, and you have yours." Daniel nodded slowly, understanding that she was right. He couldn't change the past. All he could do now was try to make amends, even if it was too late. With a heavy heart, he said goodbye to Sarah, knowing that their paths had diverged long ago. As he left the coffee shop, he couldn't help but feel that he had just seen the last piece of his past slip away. The encounter with Sarah stayed with Daniel long after he left the coffee shop. He had expected to feel relief, perhaps even a sense of closure. But instead, there was a deep ache in his chest, a feeling that he had never fully left the past behind. He had always convinced himself that leaving was the best decision for both of them. But now, face to face with Sarah, he realized just how wrong he had been. As he walked through the quiet streets of the city, his thoughts kept returning to the family he had left behind. He wondered about the children, his children. How had they turned out? Did they ever ask about him? Were they angry with him for leaving? Did they even know who he was? He thought back to when Sarah had told him she was pregnant with quadruplets. At first, it had been thrilling, even exciting. But as the reality of the situation set in, the fear had taken over. The thought of being responsible for 4 children was overwhelming. He had no idea how to handle it, and instead of facing the challenge, he had run away. He had convinced himself that he couldn't be the father they needed. But now, all these years later, he wasn't so sure. The regret weighed heavily on him. Daniel walked for hours, lost in thought, not sure where his feet were taking him. He finally found himself standing at the edge of a small park, the same park where he and Sarah had once spent time together. It seemed like a lifetime ago. He sat down on a bench and looked around, the memories flooding back. He could almost hear the laughter of the children they had dreamed of having, and he felt a pang in his heart. His mind returned to Sarah's words. "You made your choice," she had said, "and I've had to live with the consequences." Those words echoed in his mind, and he knew they were true. He had chosen to walk away from her, from them, and now he had to live with the consequences of that choice. There was no undoing the past. For a long time, Daniel sat on the bench, feeling a mix of regret, guilt, and sorrow. He had tried to bury his feelings for so long, telling himself that moving on was the only way forward. But now, after seeing Sarah again, it felt like everything he had tried to escape was coming back to him. He couldn't pretend anymore. The truth was clear. He had abandoned his family when they needed him most, and there was no way to fix that. As the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the park, Daniel made a decision. He wasn't sure how he could make up for his mistakes, but he knew that he couldn't continue living in the shadow of his past. He had to find a way to make things right, even if it was only for the sake of his children. The thought of them, their faces, their laughter, kept him going. He couldn't change what had happened, but maybe, just maybe, there was a way to be a part of their lives again. With a heavy heart, Daniel stood up from the bench, determined to take the first step. He didn't know where it would lead, but he knew he couldn't keep running from his past. The journey ahead would be difficult, but for the first time in years, Daniel felt a glimmer of hope that he could make amends and start to rebuild what he had lost. After weeks of thinking about his encounter with Sarah, Daniel made a decision. He couldn't stay away any longer. He had to know about the children, his children. He had missed out on so much, and the thought of them growing up without him made him feel like a stranger in his own life. He didn't know what he expected, but he knew he had to try to be a part of their lives, even if it was too late. One afternoon, Daniel worked up the courage to contact Sarah. He had spent days going back and forth in his mind about what to say. He didn't want to make things harder for her, but he had to know if there was a chance for him to meet the children. He hesitated for a moment before sending a simple message. "Sarah, I'd like to meet the kids, if they're willing." He sat back, heart racing, waiting for her response. It felt like hours, but after what seemed like an eternity, his phone buzzed. Sarah's reply was brief but thoughtful. "They're older now, but they deserve to know who you are. If they want to meet you, I'll let you know." The response brought both relief and anxiety. He didn't know what the kids would think of him. He didn't know if they would be angry or confused, but he had to find out. A week later, Sarah called him. "The kids want to meet you," she said. "We can meet at a park this Saturday. It's up to them if they want to talk to you." Daniel's heart raced again, but this time it was with excitement. He had a chance. He would finally meet the children he had left behind so many years ago. He wasn't sure what to expect, but he was determined to be there for them. no matter how awkward or difficult the meeting might be. The day arrived, and Daniel drove to the park with a mixture of nerves and anticipation. He arrived early, his hands gripping the steering wheel as he waited for Sarah and the kids. He could see families enjoying the sunny day, but all he could think about was how different his life could have been if he hadn't walked away. Finally, Sarah arrived with the children in tow. They were no longer the babies he remembered. They were young teenagers now, full of energy and life. The moment Daniel laid eyes on them, his heart skipped a beat. He had missed so much. They looked so different, but so familiar. Each of them had Sarah's eyes, but they also had his features, which made his heart ache even more. Sarah smiled at him, her expression warm but cautious. "This is Ethan," she said, pointing to the boy with dark hair and a strong build. "And these are the twins, Emma and Olivia," she continued, gesturing to the girls standing next to Ethan. Finally, she looked at the youngest, a shy boy with curly hair. "And this is Noah." Daniel felt a lump in his throat as he looked at each of them. They were all so different, yet all a part of him. The silence stretched between them for a moment, and Daniel wasn't sure what to say. The children looked at him curiously, but he could see the hesitation in their eyes. They didn't know him, and he wasn't sure how to explain why he had been absent for so long. "Hi," Daniel said, his voice cracking slightly. "I know I've missed a lot, but I just wanted to say that I'm sorry for leaving, and I'm really happy to meet all of you." The children stood there, unsure of what to say. But Ethan, the eldest, spoke first. "We've heard a lot about you," he said, his voice steady but distant. "I guess we all have questions, but I think it's going to take time." Daniel nodded, understanding that they couldn't just jump back into a relationship. It would take time, effort, and patience. But this was the first step. "I know," he replied quietly. "I'm here now, and I want to get to know all of you, if you'll let me." For the first time in years, Daniel felt like he was on the right path, even if it was only the beginning. Meeting his children was a dream he never thought he would have, but now that it was happening, he realized that no matter how long it took, he was willing to do whatever it took to make things right. Over the next few weeks, Daniel tried to spend as much time as possible with Ethan, Emma, Olivia, and Noah. The first few meetings were awkward, full of silence and uncertain glances. The children weren't sure what to make of him. He was their father, but he had been absent for so much of their lives. Daniel didn't blame them for being distant. He had no right to expect them to accept him right away. But he was patient, showing up when he said he would and making sure they knew he was serious about building a relationship. He took them to the park, out for ice cream, and even to a local museum. At first, the kids didn't say much. They were polite, but distant. Daniel understood. They had grown up without him, and he couldn't expect to instantly become a part of their lives again. But over time, he started to notice small changes. Noah, the youngest, began to ask questions about his life and his experiences. Emma and Olivia, who had been quieter at first, started to open up, telling Daniel about school and their hobbies. And Ethan, the oldest, began to share stories about their childhood, slowly letting Daniel in. One afternoon, they all went to the park again. This time, instead of sitting in silence, Daniel joined the kids in a game of soccer. It was messy and silly, but it made everyone laugh. For a moment, it felt like they were just a normal family, having fun together. Daniel couldn't remember the last time he had laughed so freely. The kids didn't seem as guarded as before, and for the first time, he felt a small glimmer of hope. As they sat down to catch their breath, Ethan spoke up. "So, why did you leave, Dad?" His voice was calm, but full of curiosity. It was a question that Daniel had been dreading, but he knew it was coming. Daniel looked at Ethan, then at the others. They were all waiting for an answer. He took a deep breath, his heart heavy with regret. "I was scared," he said quietly. "I thought I wasn't ready to be a father. I thought I couldn't handle it. So, I ran away. I didn't know how to be the man I needed to be." There was a long silence. Daniel could feel the weight of his words hanging in the air. The kids exchanged glances, and for a moment, it felt like time had stopped. He had expected anger, perhaps even rejection. But instead, Ethan spoke again, his voice softer this time. "I don't know if I understand it, but I think I get it," Ethan said. "You were scared, and you didn't know what to do. But we've had a good life without you. Mom has done everything. She's been both parents." Daniel's heart tightened. He had always known that Sarah had done everything on her own. But hearing Ethan say it aloud made it all the more real. He had abandoned his family, and Sarah had raised these 4 incredible kids on her own. He felt a deep sense of shame, but also a strange sense of pride. Ethan and his siblings were smart, kind, and resilient, traits that came from their mother's strength. "I'm so sorry," Daniel whispered. "I don't expect you to forgive me right away, but I want you to know that I'm here now. And I'll do whatever it takes to be the father you deserve." The kids were quiet for a while, each lost in their own thoughts. But slowly, Emma smiled and patted him on the back. "It's going to take time," she said gently, "but we're willing to try. We want to get to know you too." Daniel felt a weight lift off his shoulders. It wouldn't be easy. It wouldn't be perfect. But for the first time in years, he felt like he had a chance to make things right. He wasn't sure where this new relationship would go, but he was willing to take it one step at a time. And that, for now, was enough. As weeks turned into months, Daniel found himself spending more and more time with Ethan, Emma, Olivia, and Noah. He had come to terms with the fact that rebuilding a relationship with his children wouldn't happen overnight, but he was willing to put in the effort. Every weekend, he would find time to take them out, whether it was to the movies, for a walk in the park, or just to grab a bite to eat. Slowly, the walls between them began to lower. The children started to see him as more than just the father who had disappeared. They began to see him as someone who was genuinely trying to make up for lost time. It wasn't always easy. There were days when the kids would be distant, and Daniel would catch himself wondering if he was doing enough. He felt like an outsider in their lives, and sometimes the guilt of missing so much made him question if they would ever truly accept him back. But even on the tough days, he refused to give up. He knew that building trust took time, and he was willing to be patient. One evening, as they sat around the dinner table at Sarah's house, Daniel found himself talking more openly than he ever had before. He had always kept his feelings to himself, but tonight, surrounded by the family he had once abandoned, he felt like it was time to be honest. "I know I haven't been the father you all needed," Daniel began, looking at each of them in turn. "I can't change the past, but I want you to know that I'm here now. I'm here to stay, and I'll do whatever I can to make up for the time I missed." The kids looked at him, their faces a mix of emotions. Ethan, who had been the most guarded of them all, spoke first. "We don't expect you to be perfect, Dad," he said quietly. "We just want you to be there for us now. We're willing to try again." Daniel's heart swelled with gratitude. "Thank you," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "You have no idea how much that means to me." Sarah, who had been quietly watching the exchange, spoke up from across the table. "I've always told the kids that you're a good man, Daniel," she said softly. "I just think you lost your way for a while. But it's clear to me now that you're trying. That's all I can ask for." Daniel looked at Sarah, his eyes filled with sincerity. "I'm sorry for everything I put you through," he said, his voice full of regret. "I was selfish, and I didn't know how to handle everything that was happening. But I'm grateful for everything you've done. You've been an amazing mother to them." Sarah smiled gently, her expression softening. "We both made mistakes, Daniel," she said, her tone understanding. "But we're here now. That's what matters." The evening went on, and as they all laughed and talked together, Daniel felt a sense of peace he hadn't known in years. It wasn't perfect, but it was a start. He could see that the children were opening up to him, allowing him to be a part of their lives in a way that he had always hoped for. The road ahead wouldn't be easy, but Daniel knew that with time, patience, and love, they could rebuild their relationship. As he left Sarah's house that night, Daniel couldn't help but reflect on how far they had come. He had been given a second chance, a chance to make things right. And while he knew it would take time to heal the wounds of the past, he was more determined than ever to be the father his children deserved. For the first time in a long while, Daniel felt hope. Hope that he could finally be the man he had always wanted to be, and hope that, with enough time, his family could heal from the scars of the past. The future was uncertain, but it was a future he was ready to face. Months went by, and Daniel's relationship with his children continued to grow. He wasn't just visiting anymore. He was a part of their lives. They were no longer strangers, and he wasn't just the man who had abandoned them years ago. With every small gesture, every shared moment, Daniel found himself becoming more connected to them. They spent holidays together, celebrated birthdays, and slowly the family began to feel whole again. Daniel was careful not to rush things. He knew that trust had to be earned, and rebuilding a relationship after so many years wasn't easy. There were still difficult moments. Sometimes, the kids would look at him with a mixture of curiosity and wariness, as if they were waiting for him to disappoint them again. But Daniel didn't mind the silence or the occasional awkwardness. He understood that they had been hurt, and he was willing to give them all the time they needed. One Saturday afternoon, Sarah invited Daniel to join the family for a picnic in the park. It was a sunny day, and the kids were excited to be outside, running around and playing games. Sarah had made sandwiches, and they all sat on a large blanket, laughing and chatting. For the first time, Daniel felt like he belonged. The air was filled with the sounds of his children's laughter, and he couldn't help but smile. As they ate, Sarah turned to him with a warm smile. "You know, I've been watching you with the kids," she said, her voice full of appreciation. "You've really stepped up, Daniel. I can see how much you care about them now." Daniel looked at her, his heart swelling with gratitude. He had never expected forgiveness or approval, but hearing those words meant more than anything he had experienced in a long time. "I know I can't make up for the time I missed," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "But I'll never stop trying. I want to be here for them, for all of you." Sarah nodded, her smile softening. "I know you do, and I'm proud of you for that. It's not easy, but you're doing it." The kids were playing nearby, and Daniel watched them with a sense of awe. They had all grown into incredible young people, smart, kind, and full of energy. He had missed so much of their lives, but he was determined to be there now, to be the father they deserved. As the afternoon wore on, Daniel found himself talking to each of the children one-on-one. They weren't the little babies he remembered, but they still had a part of him in them. His eyes, his smile, his mannerisms. He was amazed at how quickly they had grown, and how much they had accomplished without him. But they were still his children, and no matter how much time had passed, he would always be there for them. Later that evening, as they all sat around the picnic blanket, Daniel felt a sense of peace. He had made mistakes, and he knew that he couldn't change the past. But he had been given a second chance, and he wasn't going to waste it. He had found his way back to his family. And no matter what challenges lay ahead, he would face them with his children by his side. As the sun set and they packed up to leave, Daniel felt a quiet pride. He had come a long way, and though the road wasn't always easy, he had built something beautiful with his family. The past could never be undone, but the future was something he could shape with love and patience, and as long as he was there for them, he knew that he had finally found his place in the world.